Tupac Shakur never filmed this role, and for a long time, nobody else was going to film it either. When John Singleton finished writing the script for Baby Boy, he had no studio waiting, no confirmed actors, and no set release date. What he did? How was a script written specifically for the man many consider the most important artist in hip-hop culture of all time? And a piece of news that destroyed that plan completely. Tupac Amaru Shakur was murdered in Las Vegas in September 1996, at just 25 years old. The script Singleton wrote for him remained tucked away in a drawer for years. This is the starting point of everything. Not just the film, but what the film represents. Baby Boy was born of grief. It was born of a broken friendship, an artistic vision that almost never reached the cinema, and a director who refused to let this story die along with the man for whom it was created. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Tupac represented in cinema at that time. He had just appeared in Juice in 1992, starred in Poetic Justice alongside Janet Jackson in 1993, and delivered one of the most disturbing performances of the decade in Above the Rim in 1994. Critics who were reluctant to take hip-hop seriously were forced to recognize that Tupac had something that isn't taught in drama school, physical and emotional presence that the camera simply couldn't ignore. Singleton already knew this. The two had talked about working together. And when Singleton began developing the idea that would become Baby Boy, there was only one actor he saw playing Jody. Then Tupac died, and the project froze. What Singleton did in the following years was what any talented filmmaker does when they lose the central anchor of a personal project. He worked on other things. He directed Rosewood in 1997, a serious and underrated film about the massacre of a black community in Florida in 1923. He worked on Shaft in 2000, a studio project very different from the type of cinema that had put him on the map. But the script for Baby Boy continued to exist. And the story he wanted to tell, this specific story about young black men in South Central Los Angeles, about irresponsible fatherhood, about dysfunctional love, about what happens when a man refuses to grow up. That story did not go away. The turning point happened in a way no one would have predicted. In 2001, Tyrese Gibson was known mainly as the handsome young man who had appeared in a Coca-Cola commercial at age 18, a familiar face on MTV, and a singer who had released an R&B album. He was not an actor. He had no formal training, no major film credits, and was not the kind of name that entered a conversation about who could fill a role created for Tupac Shakur. But Singleton saw him, and something in what Singleton saw made him believe that Tyrese had what the role required. Singleton wasn't looking for a technically trained actor. He was looking for someone who would live as Jody, who understood Jody from the inside out, and who carried the character's contradictions in their own body. Jody is simultaneously lovable and frustrating, seductive and irresponsible, capable of genuine love and everyday cruelty. He is the type of character an actor can easily ruin by being too charming or too unlikable. Tyrese, because of his own life story, growing up in Watts, California, brought an authenticity that no acting technique can replace. He wasn't interpreting this world. He had been born within it. The project's development process after Tyrese joined was, by all accounts, intense. Singleton wasn't interested in making a superficial entertainment film about South Central. He was interested in making an argument, a thesis, a statement about the psychology of an entire generation of Black American men. The title of the film is not just a character's name, it is a diagnosis. Baby boy, a boy in a man's body, someone who has grown physically but remained emotionally stuck in an infantile stage of development. Singleton had researched this theme for years. He had read the work of psychologists and academics who wrote about the specific ways in which American culture, and within it the historical experience of Black Americans, creates patterns of male behavior that stall emotional growth. The film's opening, which shows a fetus in a fetal position before revealing it is Jody, an adult man sleeping curled up, is not random. Singleton knew exactly what he was saying. From the first second, the film announces its central argument without using a single word. There is also another level to this opening that cannot be ignored. Tupac is present in the film in a very specific and deliberate way. The song, Hail Mary, plays at one of the most charged moments of the narrative. It wasn't a casual choice. It was a thoughtful tribute from a director to a friend, a way of saying that this story still belongs, in some way, to the man for whom it was written. For those who know the context, it is a moment that carries enormous weight. It is Singleton saying, without needing words, I haven't forgotten. This film is still for you. The production was assembled with a clear philosophy. No studio-built sets. No locations imitating South Central. Singleton wanted to film on the real streets, in real houses, in the real neighborhood. Charles Mills. Camera captured South Central with a documentary intimacy that you don't find in Hollywood films that try to represent these environments from the outside in. The textures, the colors washed by the Los Angeles summer sun, the yards, the cars, the faces of people who are not actors but appear in the background of every scene. All of this composes a reality that the film wears like a second skin. Baby Boy was written, directed, and produced by Singleton. He did not share the writing credit with anyone. This is the last original script he would write alone, and that says something about how personal this project was. It wasn't a work for hire. It wasn't a studio film he was hired to direct. It was the story he needed to tell, with characters he had created from scratch, in the neighborhood he had known since childhood, about a theme he believed was urgent and underrepresented in American cinema. The cast he assembled around Tyrese is one of the most underrated of the 2000s Taraji and Henson, who years later would become one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. Thanks to her work in Benjamin Button and the series Empire, had one of her first major roles here. Snoop Dogg appeared in a serious dramatic role for the first time in his career, playing a villain who is much more complicated than he seems. Rhames brought gravity and a physical presence to the role of Melvin, anchoring the film in its tensest moments. A.J. Johnson, as Wanita, Jody's mother, delivered a scene-stealing performance in ways most people don't realize the first time they watch. This ensemble, gathered by Singleton around a script that had survived the death of its original star, is what transformed Baby Boy from a personal project of a director in mourning into a work that time has treated with increasing respect. The film was released in June 2001. Sony Pictures distributed it in the United States. It grossed more than $29 million on a $16 million budget, which at the time was considered a modest result, especially for a film Columbia had gambled on as a potential summer hit. Critical reception was divided. White critics from mainstream publications tended to have difficulty with the protagonist, finding Jody hard to endure, which says less about the film and more about the lack of repertoire these critics had for complex black male characters who aren't likable in conventionally acceptable ways. Black critics and the black audience that showed up in the first few weeks had a very different reaction. For many, Baby Boy was a mirror. Painful, precise, necessary. More than 20 years later, the conversation about this film continues. It continues because Singleton was right about the story that needed to be told. Something had been bothering John Singleton for years. It wasn't exactly rage. It was more like that feeling of seeing an important conversation that never happened, of watching the world spin around a problem that everyone recognized, but no one had the courage to name directly. And Singleton was the kind of filmmaker who, when he felt that itch, didn't write articles. He made films in 1991, at only 23. He became the youngest filmmaker and the first black man to be nominated for the Academy Award for Best Director. The film was Boysie in the Hood. If you've never seen it, you need to understand what that film meant. It wasn't just a well-executed neighborhood drama. It was a cultural shock. It was a camera pointed at South Central Los Angeles with an honesty that mainstream American cinema had never attempted. It was the film that put Ice Cube, Morris Chestnut, and Cuba Gooding Jr. on the map. It was the film that made the Hollywood Academy sit and pay attention to a 23-year-old black director from Inglewood, California. The success of Boys in the Hood opened doors, but it also created a subtle trap Singleton would spend years trying to escape. When you make an extraordinary film about a very specific subject very early in your career, the whole world defines you by it. Singleton spent the 90s navigating projects that tried, and didn't always succeed, to capture the same strength as that first work. Poetic Justice in 1993 with Janet Jackson and Tupac had genuinely beautiful moments but didn't reach the same impact. Higher Learning in 1995 was ambitious and often powerful but divided critics. Rosewood in 1997, perhaps his most serious and underrated work of the decade, received respect but not an audience. Shaft in 2000 was a commercial success, but was not the type of cinema that had made him famous. And then, between projects, there was the script for Baby Boy, waiting. What Singleton was processing while writing this script was not just the story of a fictional character. It was a theory, an observation of behavioral patterns he had seen repeated throughout his life in South Central, among the men he knew, in the relationships he had observed closely. The theory was this, that an entire generation of black American men had been raised never to grow up emotionally. Not because these men were lazy or bad, but because of a specific combination of historical, cultural, and familial forces that produced adult men who functioned emotionally like children, dependent, reactive, incapable of assuming genuine responsibility, trapped in a cycle of immediate pleasure and flight from consequences. Singleton made references to the work of thinkers who wrote about black American masculinity, the influence of the work of psychiatrist and activist Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, who wrote about the effects of systemic racism on the psychological formation of the black American man, can be felt throughout the film's thematic structure. This is not interpretation. Singleton spoke publicly about the readings and research that informed his writing. Baby Boy is not a film that emerged from a vague intuition. It is a film built on a thesis, and every character, every scene, every script choice serves that thesis in some way. The question Singleton was asking the question. The film asks, without ever verbalizing it, didactically is this: why do so many young men in Black American communities reach adulthood without the emotional tools to build something sustainable? Why does the cycle of absent fatherhood, unstable relationships, and violence as a default response to stress continue to reproduce itself from generation to generation? And more importantly, what would it take for a man trapped in this cycle to find a way out? Jody is the case study. He is not a hollow symbol, not a simplified parable. He is a completely realized human being with real contradictions, with moments of genuine tenderness that coexist with behaviors that are difficult to defend. Singleton constructed Jody this way intentionally, because if Jody was simply a villain, the film would be comfortable. The audience could watch from a distance and say, well, this guy is problematic. I'm glad I'm not like that. But when Jody is lovable, when you laugh with him, when you understand the love he has for Yvette, even while he hurts her, when you see the vulnerability he hides under all the performance of masculinity, the film becomes uncomfortable in the right way. You can't watch from afar. The film pulls you in. This was a conscious artistic choice by Singleton, and it is the choice that separated Baby Boy from dozens of other films about Black American communities made before and after it. American cinema had a long tradition of portraying black men from the ghetto in two ways, either as tragic victims of the system or as dangerous threats to be feared. Baby Boy refused to accept either mode. Jody is a young man with agency, intelligence, love, and flaws. He is responsible for his own choices, even when those choices were shaped by circumstances he didn't choose. This complexity is the heart of the film. The writing process was, according to Singleton, deeply influenced by Tupac's death. Not only in the obvious sense that mourning for his friend fueled the project's emotional urgency, but also because Tupac was, in Singleton's view, the most visible and tragic example of the very phenomenon the film examines. A man of extraordinary talent, of uncommon intelligence, trapped in a cycle of self-destructive behaviors he knew were self-destructive and yet could not, or would not, stop. The contradiction of Tupac, the man who recorded Dear Mama and also glorified violence, the man who read philosophy books and also carried guns. This contradiction is Jody's contradiction on a larger scale. There is a direct line between what Singleton felt losing Tupac and what he put into the script for Baby Boy. It is not an explicit movie about grief. There is nothing in the script that directly says, this film is dedicated to Tupac. But those who know the context, who know that this script was written for that specific man, hear the film differently, especially when Tupac's music enters. The soundtrack at the most charged moments. Singleton was also responding, with Baby Boy, to an absence in Black American cinema at the time. In the early 2000s, Hollywood had absorbed and largely domesticated the independent black cinema movement that had exploded in the 90s. The market wanted romantic comedies with black protagonists. It wanted action films with black stars, in roles that could have been written for any race. What the market was not asking for was a long, uncomfortable drama about an irresponsible young man from South Central who treats women poorly, doesn't pay his bills, and has difficulty assuming the fatherhood of his own children. Nobody was asking for this film. Singleton made it anyway. He secured the support of Columbia Pictures and New Deal Productions for a production with a budget of $16 million, modest amount for a US studio film, but enough to do what Singleton needed to do, which was to film in South Central with a cast and crew that respected the material. Columbia granted the project a degree of creative control that personal projects rarely get from major studios, which spoke to the reputation Singleton had built since Boys End the Hood. The result of this process, of this grief, this thesis, this refusal to make a comfortable film, was a work that, when it hit the screens in June 2001, didn't quite know where it fit. It wasn't violent enough to be a gang movie in the classic sense. It wasn't optimistic enough to be a conventional redemption story. It wasn't an action movie, not a comedy, not a romance. It was a character drama built around an idea, and ideas don't fit easily into the boxes Hollywood uses to sell movies. But sometimes, the films that don't fit into any box are exactly the ones time treats best. And Baby Boy is proof of that. There is a name most people don't associate with Baby Boy, but who could have changed everything if things had taken another turn. That name is Ice Cube, the character of Rodney, the violent ex-con who returns to Wanita's life and represents the most concrete threat to Jodie's universe, was originally written with Ice Cube in mind. It makes total sense when you think about it. Ice Cube had just worked with Singleton on Boys End the Hood 10 years earlier, playing Doughboy, one of that film's most memorable characters. The creative chemistry between the two was established. Ice Cube's credibility for a role like Rodney, a man who came out of prison carrying violence in his backbone, but also with a capacity for seduction that explains why Wanita lets him back into her life, was undeniable, but Ice Cube was not available. He had other commitments, other projects underway, and the timing simply didn't work. Singleton needed to find another path for Rodney, and the path he found led to one of the most surprising and successful casting choices of the entire production: Snoop. Dogg in 2001 was many things, but a serious dramatic actor was not on the list. He was the architect of West Coast gangster rap, the man who had appeared on Dr. Dre's Doggy Style album in 1992 and become a phenomenon practically overnight. He had appeared in films before, but in smaller roles, usually fictionalized versions of himself, the famous rapper who enters the scene, cracks a joke, and leaves. No one had asked Snoop Dogg to transform into a genuinely threatening and psychologically complex character in a studio production. Singleton asked. And what Snoop delivered as Rodney is one of the most underrated things in the entire filmography. Of the duo, Rodney is not a cardboard villain. He is a man the system destroyed and rebuilt wrong, who knows how to be charming when he needs to be and violent when he decides to be, who has a kind of disturbing internal logic that makes sense within his own terms. Snoop brought something to this character that no conventionally trained actor could have brought in the same way. A lived credibility you feel on your skin. When Rodney looks at Jodie with that calm smile that doesn't reach his eyes, you believe the threat. Not because Snoop is acting threat, because Snoop simply is a presence, and Singleton knew how to put that presence in the right place. The most interesting part of Snoop's casting story is that Singleton didn't choose him despite the lack of dramatic experience. He chose him because of what Snoop brought that dramatic experience doesn't provide. There is a naturalism in Snoop as Rodney that is almost documentary. The mannerisms, the rhythm of speech, the way he fills the physical space of a scene, all of it is absolutely organic. And Singleton, who built the film's entire production philosophy around authenticity, knew what he was doing. Then came Tyrese. The full story of how Tyrese Gibson went from being the face of MTV to the protagonist of a John Singleton. Drama is more interesting than the summary version most people know. Tyrese grew up in Wattsay, California, in one of Los Angela's toughest neighborhoods. He wasn't raised far from Jodie's universe. He grew up inside it, or very close to it. When he was 18, he appeared in a Coca-Cola commercial that became a national phenomenon, and suddenly he was the handsome young man everyone knew. He recorded songs, made appearances, and built a kind of public presence that didn't have much to do with acting. Singleton saw something in him that went beyond looks or fame. What he saw, according to his own accounts of the process, was someone who carried Jodie's contradiction naturally, someone who could be simultaneously disarming and closed off, magnetic and frustrating. Tyrese auditioned for the role, and in those auditions there was one specific scene that sealed everything: the crying scene. There is a moment in the film where Jodie cries for Rilna, the contained, controlled crying most actors deliver when the script calls for tears, but the crying of someone who is falling apart inside. In the auditions, when that scene happened, the room went silent. Tyrese wasn't demonstrating a technique. He was accessing something real. Singleton knew right then that he had found his Jodie. It's worth noting that Tyrese prepared in a way that matches the general philosophy of the entire production. There was no Stanislavski method or weeks of research in theatre conservatories. What there was immersion in the universe he already knew, conversations with Singleton about who Jodie was on the inside, and a willingness to expose himself emotionally in a way many more experienced actors would have resisted. Baby Boy was the film that transformed Tyrese from a celebrity into an actor, and the difference is enormous. Taraji P. Henson as Yvette is another chapter in this casting story that time has put into perspective. In 2001, Taraji was an actress, with a few minor credits, completely unknown to the general public. What she had was raw talent and an ability to inhabit complex female characters without judging them, which for Yvette was absolutely essential. Yvette could have become a passive character, the girlfriend who endures and endures. In Taraji's hands, she is much more than that. There is a specific scene, which will be detailed later, where Yvette and Jodie are in a verbal confrontation that escalates into something more physical and charged. And what Taraji does in that scene with her eyes, her body, and the silence she sustains afterward is the work of an actress who isn't just following script directions. She is living a moment. Singleton knew it instantly. And anyone watching Baby Boy, knowing who Taraji P. Henson became later with her Oscar nomination for Benjamin, but in 2009 and her dominant presence in Empietheals, a particular satisfaction in revisiting this performance. She was already everything right here. The industry just took longer to realize it. Omar Gooding as Sweet Pea, Jodie's best friend and partner in adventures, brings energy to the film that in other contexts might seem comic, but Singleton uses it with precision. Sweet Pea is not comic relief. He is the most direct mirror of Jodie, the companion who shares the same behavioral patterns but without any of the internal conflicts that at least make Jodie aware, at some level, of his own contradictions. There are scenes where Sweet Pea says out loud things Jodie thinks but wouldn't say, and Omar carries this narrative function with a lightness that hides how much thematic heavy lifting the character is doing. A.J. Johnson as Wanita, Jodie's mother, is perhaps the cast member whose preparation process best fits the film's general philosophy. Johnson, who had previously appeared in House Party in the early 90s, dived into the role in a way that went beyond what the script required. There are reports that she spent significant time in South Central talking to women of Wanitas. Generation women who had been very young mothers, who had raised children practically alone, and who were now reaching a phase of life where they finally wanted to live for themselves, only to find that their adult sons weren't ready to let them go. This research shows up in the film. Wanita is not a script mother. She is a woman with a whole history that existed before the first scene, and will continue to exist after the last. And then there's Ving Rhames. Rhames in 2001 was known mainly for his work in Pulp Fiction as Marcellus Wallace, the role that forever established his particular combination of physical authority and emotional intensity in the collective memory. As Melvin Wanita's boyfriend and a reformed ex-con who becomes a kind of involuntary father figure for Jody, Rhames brings a dimension to the film that balances the volatility of everything around it. Melvin is the only adult male character in the film who has come out the other side of something, who has lived the life Jody and Rodney represent and found a way out. Rhames carries this in his body, his voice, and the way Melvin looks at Jody with a recognition that isn't judgment, but knowing. There are reports that Rhames felt, upon reading the original script, that Melvin had even more depth than the version that made it to the final cut, that there were scenes, conversations between Melvin and Jody, that deepened the relationship between the two in ways the final film only suggests. This is something that will be revisited later when the conversation about what was cut and why needs to happen. What this cast has in common, from Tyrese to Taraji, from Snoop to Rhames, is that each person was chosen by Singleton not despite who they were, but because of who they were. Each one brought something from their own life, their own history, their own irreducible presence that no conventional casting process would have produced. Together, they created a world the film inhabits with an authenticity that is hard to fake and impossible to manufacture. The film begins before any word is spoken. An image, a fetus in a fetal position, floating in a dark space, shrouded in a soft light that seems almost sacred. Then the camera pulls back, and what seemed like an ultrasound image reveals itself to be something else entirely. It is Jody, a 20-year-old man with a large and young body, sleeping curled up in bed like a child who never learned to occupy the space of his own size. The camera stays there a moment longer than you would expect, long enough for the idea to land completely. This man is still a baby. This is the premise. This is the argument. And it was told without a single word. It is an extraordinary opening because it refuses condescension. Singleton isn't ridiculing Jody with this image. He is diagnosing him. There is an enormous difference between the two, and the entire film lives within that difference. The first dialogue scene places Jody in a vet in a clinic. She is pregnant. This isn't Jody's first child. He already has a small son with another woman, a girl named Peanut who also has a son by him. The clinic scene is not melodramatic. There is no heavy music, no performative tears, no speeches about the sacredness of life. What there is a conversation between two young people navigating a situation for which neither has enough maturity, with a naturalness that seems caught by a hidden camera rather than staged. Singleton films the scene with a proximity that gives the audience no room to pull back. You are in the clinic with them, and already in this first scene, you understand the central dynamic of the film. Jody isn't evil. He isn't indifferent. He's present. He's holding Yvette's hand. He is saying the right things on the surface. But beneath all that, there is an absence, a lack of real weight in what he says. as if the words were tokens he learned to use without fully understanding what they buy. And Yvette knows it. You see it on her face. She stays anyway. Because she loves him. And because she still believes the man she sees in flashes, the man Jody could be, will eventually show up for good after the clinic. The film expands Jody's world in layers. He lives with his mother Wanita in a modest house. In South Central, he is 20 years old. He doesn't pay rent. He has no formal job. He does small, informal business, selling clothes and accessories out of a backpack, the kind of activity that generates enough money for cigarettes and gas, but not for real responsibility. Wanita's house is his space, but Wanita has been moving away from being Jody's space for some time. She has a boyfriend, Melvin, and Melvin lives with her. Melvin's arrival in Jody's domestic life is one of the central triggers of the narrative, and Singleton introduces it with an economy of resources that is elegant. There is no formal introduction scene, no dramatic moment, where the two stare each other down for the first time. Melvin is simply there. In the mornings, in the bathroom, at the breakfast table, in Wanita's car. In the space Jody unconsciously still considers his territory. And Jody's reaction to this presence reveals more about him than any monologue could. Jody doesn't want a man in his mother's life, not because Melvin is bad, which Melvin clearly is not. Jody doesn't want a man in his mother's life, because a mother, without a man as a mother who belongs entirely to him. It is an Oedipal dynamic the film names quite directly at a certain point, without subterfuge, without euphemism, and with a kind of honesty the commercial American cinema usually avoids. Singleton was clearly interested in saying the difficult thing for once. On the other side of Jody's life is Yvette. She has a child with him, lives in her own apartment, works, pays her own bills, and functions as an adult in a way Jody simply cannot yet. The irony is not subtle. Yvette, the woman Jody treats as property in many moments, is the most functional adult in the entire relationship. She has structure, routine, and responsibility. Yet she keeps Jody in her orbit, lets him sleep over frequently, and tolerates behavioral patterns she knows are problematic. Yvette's house is filmed differently from Wanita's. There is more light, more visual order in the shots. It is a space a woman built with real work, and Charles Mill's camera records this difference in texture so that you feel it before you can articulate it. This type of visual storytelling is one of the things that separates Baby Boy from similar films that rely only on dialogue to convey information about characters. Sweet Pea enters. The film is a natural extension of Jody the friend who exists, in a permanent state of availability for small-scale adventures and large consequence decisions. Omar Gooding brings an energy to this character that is immediately legible. You understand Sweet Pea in 30 seconds of screen time. He is the type of man who thinks life should be permanently funny and reacts to seriousness with sarcasm, not out of malice, but because seriousness is a country he never learned to visit. The scenes of Jody and Sweet Pea together have an authenticity of Southern California bromance that is almost ethnographic. The slang, the gestures, the rhythm of conversations, the humor of those who grew up together and don't need to finish sentences. But Sweet Pea carries beneath all that lightness a volatility the film makes visible early on. He reacts to insults with a speed that suggests accumulation, a willingness to escalate situations that in other contexts would be clinical. But here is simply the default operating mode of a man who learned that weakness is dangerous. There is a scene early in the film where Sweepy and Jody are in a different neighborhood from theirs for an encounter that should be simple. And the way the tension rises and resolves or almost doesn't resolve establishes the tone for a narrative that knows violence is never more than a misunderstanding away. The South Central. The film shows is not the South Central of new symmetry, that abstract space of crime statistics and aerial helicopter shots. It is a neighborhood with temperature, a palpable smell, and a daily routine with its own rhythms and codes. The real streets where Singleton filmed, the real houses, the real cars, the faces of real people appearing in the background, all of this composes a visual document of a place and a time that cinema has rarely captured with such specificity. The decision to film entirely on location was not just aesthetic. It was political. It was a declaration that this neighborhood and these people deserved to be filmed with the same attention and respect any other environment would receive in a studio. Production. No fake South Central was built on a Columbia backlot. There was the real South Central, with all its complexity and particular beauty, captured by Charles Mills' camera with an intimacy that required the production crew to become part of the landscape before starting to film it. The film's first act ends with Jody's world completely established. You know who he is, where he lives, who he cares about, what he's afraid of, what he wants, and what he can't admit he wants. You know the women in his life, the mother he needs to let go of but cannot, and the girlfriend he needs to value but doesn't know how. You know the friends who keep him trapped in the same patterns, and the older man who represents the only visible alternative route. Then, as the second act begins, Singleton tightens the screw. Knowing the characters is one thing. Seeing what happens when the world they built around themselves begins to crack. That is the film. There is a scene in Baby Boy that summarizes Jody and Yvette's entire relationship in less than 2 minutes. Jody is lying on Yvette's bed, relaxed, comfortable in her space as if it were his own. Yvette comes in, tired, having worked all day. She wants to rest. And Jody starts talking, making jokes, pulling her back into his mode, his rhythm, his world that revolves around his needs. And Yvette smiles, despite everything, despite the exhaustion, despite knowing exactly what is happening. She smiles. Because she loves this man, and because that smile is as much a surrender as it is a choice. Singleton films this moment without comment. No music telling you how to feel. No dramatic cut underlining the irony. Just the camera, the two of them, and the space between them that is full of things neither can say directly. This is the emotional center of the film. Not the violence, not the conflicts with Rodney, not the tension with Melvin. The center is this relationship, this complicated, real thing Jody and Yvette have, which is simultaneously the best and worst of both of them. Jody loves Yvette. This is important to state clearly because the film leaves no doubt about it. It isn't a perfect love, not a mature love, not a love he knows how to express in healthy, consistent ways. But it is real. There are scenes where you see Jody look at Yvette with a tenderness that isn't performance, that isn't being displayed for anyone, that simply exists. And Tyrese Gibson, who could have played Jody entirely as the problematic guy who frustrates the audience, found in these moments of tenderness the balance that makes the character human rather than just insufferable. The problem isn't the absence of love. The problem is what Jody does with that love, or rather, what he doesn't do. He uses it as a substitute for everything else. As if loving Yvette were enough to compensate for infidelity, irresponsibility, control, and the refusal to build something concrete alongside her. As if the feeling itself were the currency of the relationship, independent of the actions that should accompany it. And here the film does something very few romantic dramas have the courage to do. It shows how genuine love can coexist with genuinely destructive behavior, without absolving or condemning either side in a simplistic way. Jody hurts Yvette and loves her at the same time. Yvette knows she's being hurt and stays anyway. Neither of these realities cancels the other. Both are true simultaneously. And it's in that simultaneity that people's real, emotional lives usually exist. The most difficult scene in the film between the two, the one many critics chose as the point of greatest discomfort, involves a conflict. Escalation from verbal to physical in a way the film doesn't romanticize, but doesn't resolve with narrative ease. Singleton films this moment with a camera that doesn't pull back, doesn't cut to something easier to watch, and insists on showing it happening in real time. It is uncomfortable in the most intentionally honest way possible. There is no suspense, music, no reaction shots telling the audience how to process what they are seeing. There is only the scene with all its weight, and the camera that refuses the comfort of withdrawal. What Taraji P. Henson does in this scene and the scenes immediately following is the most remarkable work of the entire film. The temptation for any actress in this moment would be to play the victim entirely, to turn Yvette into a symbol of female suffering, to make the audience feel pity in a way that closed the character into a single emotional state. Taraji doesn't do that. What she does is more complex and truer. Yvette, after this moment, is still Yvette. She still has pride. She still has rage. She still has love. She still has the capacity to make decisions that are hers, emerging from who she is and not just reacting to what Jody did. She doesn't become a victim. She remains the subject of her own story, even in the most difficult circumstances. This is what makes Yvette one of the best written and best acted female characters in American cinema of that decade, even if the film rarely gets explicit credit. For it, the dynamic of jealousy is another territory the film explores with uncomfortable honesty. Jody is jealous of Yvette in a way he himself cannot articulate coherently, because articulating it would require admitting that the jealousy doesn't come from love but from ownership, not from fear of losing someone, but fear of losing territory. There is a scene where a man from Yvette's work appears, completely innocently, and what passes across Jody's face in that moment, that specific combination of insecurity masked as threat, is something Tyrese carries with a precision that makes you recognize the pattern even if you've never lived that specific situation. Singleton also doesn't leave Yvette without agency in this dynamic. There are moments where she uses Jody's jealousy deliberately, where she knows a certain piece of information will produce a certain reaction and chooses to deliver it anyway. Not out of malice, but for the very human reason that sometimes the only way someone has to feel important to another person is by provoking an emotional reaction, whatever it may be. Both are trapped in a system of emotional cause and effect that neither created alone and neither can dismantle alone. The son they have together, Jojo, exists in the film as a constant presence they both genuinely love, and yet neither yet knows how to prioritize completely. Jody is a father who loves his son, but hasn't organized his own life to give that love real structure. He shows up, plays, does the visible and immediate fatherly things, but the fatherly things that are invisible in continuous stability, predictability, building a safe environment those he hasn't reached yet, and Yvette covers the difference, as she covers so many other differences between what Jody promises and what he delivers. Tyrese's performance in this part of the narrative has a specific element worth noting. There is a vulnerability he exposes in Jody that never feels strategic. When Jody cries, and there is that scene mentioned briefly, it's a cry that feels too real to be just act or technique. Singleton confirmed in interviews that there were moments on set where the line between what Tyrese was playing and what he was truly feeling was genuinely thin. This kind of work has a personal cost that doesn't appear in the credits but appears on the screen. And it appears in Baby Boy in a way you feel without necessarily being able to name it. The relationship between Jody and Yvette, represented thematically in the film, is something Singleton articulated in several interviews. It's not a story about a bad man and a good woman. It's a story about two young people shaped by circumstances neither chose, who have behavioral patterns they learned before having the vocabulary to question them, and who are trying, each in their own way and with the limited tools they have, to build something worthwhile in an environment that didn't prepare them for that. Construction. This doesn't absolve Jody. The film doesn't try to absolve him, but it explains where the pattern comes from. And that distinction between absolving and explaining is one of the most important cinema can make when examining complex human behavior. When the second act reaches its tipping point, when things between Jody and Yvette reach a moment demanding a real decision, not a promise, not an intention, but a decision with concrete consequences, the film puts on the table the question it had been building since the first scene in the clinic. Is this man going to grow up? Will he find within himself what he needs to be the partner and father he says he wants to be? Or will he remain the baby the camera showed in the opening? The answer the film gives is not simple. It never was. And that is exactly why it's still worth watching. There's a moment in the film where Melvin is sitting at Wanita's kitchen table, drinking coffee, reading the newspaper, simply existing in that space with a calmness that seems almost provocative. Jody enters, and the two look at each other. There is no dialogue in this moment. It isn't necessary. What exists between them in that silence is an entire conversation about power, territory, masculinity, and the difference between who, Jody, is now and who he would have to become to occupy the space Melvin occupies with such ease. Ving. Rhames doesn't need words to make Melvin speak. It's one of the rarest qualities an actor can have, and Rhames uses it here with a precision you only fully notice the second or third time you watch the film. Melvin is the most strategically positioned character in the entire narrative. He is what Rodney could have been if he had taken other paths. He is what Jody would need to become if he wants a life worth anything. He is the man who came out the other side of a violent existence and found something more solid to build. And he carries all this weight without ever making speeches about it, without ever setting himself up as an example to be followed, without ever using his own trajectory as currency for moral authority over Jody. Melvin's restraint is intentional and wise, because a preaching Melvin would be easy to ignore. A Melvin who simply exists, who simply is what he is in Jody's presence without asking for recognition, is impossible to ignore in the right way. Jody can't just dismiss Melvin as an old man trying to give a lesson. because Melvin isn't giving any lesson, he's just living. And that life, that stability, that real and functional love Melvin has with Wanita is a silent and constant accusation against Jodi's way of existing. The relationship between Melvin and Jodi, as layers the film reveals gradually. In the beginning, it's pure territorial hostility from Jodi, the instinctive rejection of the man who dared enter the maternal space. But there is a scene in the middle of the film, in a conversation during a moment of relative truce, where Melvin says something to Jodi that is both simple and devastatingly precise. I won't reproduce the dialogue directly, but the substance is this: that being a man is not what you do to your enemies, but what you build for the people you say you love. Jodi listens. He doesn't agree out loud. He probably doesn't agree out loud because agreeing would require admitting Melvin is right, and admitting that would be admitting how much he is failing. But you see that he heard. You see that something landed. Rhames spoke in interviews about how Singleton's original script for Melvin was even richer than what made it to the final cut. There were scenes exploring Melvin's history in more depth, showing specifically what he had done in the past and the process by which he had transformed. These scenes, according to documentation, were cut during editing for reasons of rhythm and duration. As a result, Melvin, in the final cut, is a slightly more mysterious character than Singleton originally intended, which works in a way, but also leaves a feeling that there is a whole story beneath the surface the film only suggests. This isn't a fatal flaw. It's a consequence of the inevitable negotiations between a director's vision and the nitdarek. And in my imagination, the world seems to pause. The world seems to pause, leaves a feeling that there is a whole story beneath the surface the film beneath the surface the film only suggests. This isn't a fatal flaw. It's a consequence of flaw. It's a consequence of the inevitable negotiations between a director's vision and a Western spec, and a preset and now, the way and an practical demands of a studio production. But it's a real loss, and those who watch Baby Boy with attention sometimes feel Melvin deserved more screen time than he got. Wanita, on the other hand, gets enough screen time for A.J. Johnson to build something memorable and genuinely moving. Johnson has one of the hardest tasks of the entire cast because Wanita occupies a narrative position that is easy to make schematic. She is the mother. In American cinema, the mother is usually either a saint or a villain, either the unconditional safe harbor or the source of all trauma. Singleton and Johnson refuse to accept either mode. Wanita is a woman who had a son very young, raised that son practically alone, and did so with genuine love, but also with a series of choices that, looking back, she can see contributed to who Jodi became. She loved him in a way that was sometimes protection and sometimes suffocation. She covered his deficiencies in ways that were sometimes care and sometimes sabotage of the growth he needed to do. And now, with Melvin, she is finally trying to build a life that is hers, not just in function of Jodi. And Jodi cannot let that happen without resistance. The mother-son dynamic in Baby Boy is described in terms cinema rarely uses with such frankness. Singleton puts a direct reference to the Oedipus complex into a character's mouth at one point. The psychological bond between mother and son that, when not properly resolved in adolescence, continues operating in adult life in ways that hinder the man's emotional and relational development. It's a reference that could seem too didactic, sounding like a screenwriter inserting research directly into dialogue. But Singleton places it in such a natural context, in a conversation flowing so organically from what the characters are living at that moment, that it works. There is a scene between Wanita and Jody, near the turn of the second act, that A.J. Johnson and Tyrese Gibson play with an emotional openness that is hard to watch without feeling something move inside your chest. Wanita is trying to say something that needed to be said years ago. Jody is listening with all the resistance of someone who knows the message is true and that the truth will require him to change. What the scene captures, what these two actors find together in that moment, is the rarest thing in cinema. A conversation between a mother and an adult son that sounds completely real, completely unrehearsed, completely human. A.J. Johnson prepared for this scene in a way worth mentioning. She spent significant time talking to real women from South Central about the experience of being mothers to sons in contexts of paternal absence, about the impossible balance between protecting and letting go, and about the guilt of realizing, years later, that some forms of love were also forms of control. That research lives in her throughout the scene, not as displayed information, but as the substance grounding every choice she makes. Together, Melvin and Wanita represent a possibility in the film. Not a utopia, not a perfect model of a relationship, but a demonstration that it is possible. To get to the other side of the circumstances that created Jody and Rodney and still build something with meaning. They don't have a conflict-free relationship. They don't live in a bubble protected from the same forces operating in the rest of the film. But they have something no other couple in the film has: the capacity to be present for each other consistently, to choose construction over destruction when both options are available. For Jody, watching this up close is simultaneously irritating and instructive. Irritating because Melvin's presence requires him to see himself. Instructive because, even if he won't admit it, Melvin's existence proves the other path is real. That it isn't just talk, that you can get there, that destiny is not fixed. This is the most important function Melvin serves in the film. Not as Jody's antagonist, not as a threat, but as living proof that growth is possible. It is silent, indirect, sometimes exasperating for Jody, and sometimes almost invisible to the audience. But it's there, working every moment Melvin appears, on screen. And when the film reaches its most violent and consequential point, it will be the existence of this silent proof that matters more than any confrontation or any speech. Snoop, Dogg enters the film for the first time, and the air changes. That is no exaggeration. It is a technical observation about what happens to the visual and emotional dynamics of any scene when Snoop Dogg as Rodney appears in it. There is a quality to his presence that is hard to catalogue using conventional film criticism vocabulary, because it isn't exactly acting in the sense taught in drama schools. It's something more like gravity of force that reorganizes everything around it without needing to struggle for it. Rodney is introduced gradually, almost laterally. You hear him before you see him clearly. You feel the effect he has on Wanita before you fully understand who he is. And when Singleton finally places him in full frame, when Charles Milt's camera stays with Rodney long enough for you to read him, what you see is something American gangster cinema rarely achieves: a villain. You understand completely without making him any less threatening. Rodney spent years in prison. What prison did to him isn't shown in flashbacks or explained in expository dialogue. It is in his body. It is in the way he occupies space, in the constant vigilance of his eyes, in the economy of his movements, in the smile that appears too fast and disappears the same way. There is a scene where Rodney is sitting in a room with other people, and even in silence. Without doing anything, he is the highest point of tension in the scene. That is presence. That is what Singleton went looking for in Snoop Dogg, and what Snoop delivered in a way that exceeded any reasonable expectation. Anyone could have had for a rapper doing his first serious dramatic role. The decision to cast Snoop was, according to Singleton himself, based on a simple conviction that credibility cannot be faked for an audience that knows the original. The audience that went to see Baby Boy in 2001, especially the black audience from Southern California, for whom the film was made first and foremost, knew Snoop Dogg. They knew his history, the street credibility he carried, the legal problems he faced at the start of his career, the universe he came from. Casting Snoop as Rodney was a move operating at two levels simultaneously, within the film as a dramatic performance, and outside the film as a statement of cultural authenticity. The right audience read both levels at once, resulting in a kind of heightened verisimilitude no actor with conventional training could have produced in that specific way. What makes Rodney complex, what prevents him from being just the functional villain the narrative needs to create tension is the Singleton wrote an internal logic for him that makes sense on its own terms. Rodney isn't violent out of abstract malice. He is the product of a system that processed him and returned him, broken in specific ways. The American prison system does not rehabilitate. That is not an opinion. It is documented data. And Rodney is what happens when a man with serious impulse and control problems spends years in an environment that punishes any demonstration of vulnerability and rewards the willingness for violence. What came out the other side is a man who learned the wrong lessons very well. But there is also, buried beneath all that, a capacity for affection Rodney has for Wanita that is real. Singleton twists this in disturbing ways throughout the film, showing how love and control can be so intertwined in the same set of behaviors that the person experiencing them both, the giver and the receiver, has difficulty separating them. Rodney loves Wanita the only way he knows how to love, which is possessive, territorial, and sometimes violent. And Wanita has a history with this man that doesn't simply vanish because she decided to move on with Melvin. The past doesn't disappear because the present is better. It keeps operating, pulling, complicating. Sweet Pea and the threat he represents within the narrative work in a different but equally important way. Omar Gooding built a character who on the surface seems like Jodie's funny adventure companion, but reveals a darker dimension over the film with very well-calculated gradation. Sweet Pea isn't problematic in an obvious and immediate way. He is problematic in the way people who grew up in that environment recognize. He makes impulsive decisions that have consequences for everyone around him, without necessarily processing the cost of those consequences before acting. There is an incident involving Sweet Pea in the second act that changes Jodie's security equation drastically. I won't detail what happens with the specificity of a full spoiler, because the way Singleton builds toward that moment and what comes after depends on you not knowing exactly when it will happen. But what I can say is that this incident puts Jodie in a position where the abstractions of neighborhood masculinity, the unwritten code of loyalty and retribution he grew up respecting suddenly have consequences that arrive at his door in a very concrete and dangerous way. It is at this point that Rodney and the threat he represents stop being just a domestic problem and become a matter of survival. The collision between these two lines of tension, the tension of the relationship with Yvette and the external threat, represented by Rodney's what Singleton uses to build the film's third act, and it is here that Baby Boy moves most clearly. Away from the structure of domestic drama and closer to something with the tone of a thriller. The climax sequence, involving Rodney, Jody, and the interior of Yvette's house, is filmed with a restraint that actually increases the weight of what is happening. Singleton doesn't use the visual grammar of action cinema for this scene. There is no stylized slow motion, no tension music preparing the audience for what is coming. There is only a situation that has reached a point of no return, to men in the same space, and the camera observing with the coldness of one who knows there is no stopping what will happen. What Jody does in this sequence is the most decisive act of the film. It is the moment he acts truly, without hesitation and without the possibility of pretending it wasn't him making that choice. And what Singleton does with this moment in the script is refuse the easy resolution. There is no triumphal music afterward. No relief scene where everyone breathes deep and smiles. What there is the weight of what was done landing on Jody silently and immediately, and Tyrese carrying that weight on his face in a way that dispenses with any dialogue. The violence in Baby Boy is not gratuitous and not glorified. This needs to be said explicitly because it is a distinction separating the film from many others navigating similar territory. Violence here has real consequences that the film doesn't let the audience forget. It has moral weight. It has emotional cost. More importantly, it emerges from a context the film spent the whole time building. So when it happens, it doesn't feel like a genre event, but a logical consequence of a specific set of circumstances and specific human choices. Rodney as a character ends the film in a way that is neither victory nor defeat in the conventional sense of those terms. What happens to Rodney is a resolution carrying the complexity the character deserved throughout the film. You don't feel simple satisfaction with his fate. You feel the weight of a man whose destiny was written by forces much larger than his own choices, even if his own choices were part of the equation. Snoop Dogg would never again play a dramatic role with this level of commitment and complexity. There is something ironic and a bit sad in that. Baby Boy proves definitively that there was a real actor inside that musician. Someone capable of sustaining a dramatic presence in a John Singleton film with actors on the level of Ving Rhames and Taraji P. Henson. That this performance did not result in more serious dramatic opportunities for Snoop is one of the small losses the cinema of the time committed without realizing it. There is something American studio cinema does very poorly when trying to portray urban black communities. And it is a problem of sound before it is a problem of image. The sound is wrong. The music is wrong. The soundtrack smells of marketing decisions, committee approval, someone in a Burbank office choosing tracks representing Hollywood's idea of how South Central sounds rather than how it actually sounds. Baby Boy does not make this mistake, not even close. John Singleton's musical decision for this film starts with a choice that seems simple but carries huge weight. Tupac is on the soundtrack. Not discreetly, not in a background track you only noticed if you're paying attention. Tupac is there deliberately. Placed at a specific moment in the film Singleton chose with the care of someone who knows this choice will be felt in ways transcending conventional musical function. Hail Mary appears at one of the narrative's most charged moments. If you know the song, if you know what Tupac was saying on that track, if you understand the context in which it was recorded a few days before his death, during a period when he knew he was living on a fringe of real danger then, Singleton's choice to put it exactly there in the film makes all the difference. It isn't nostalgia. It isn't a decorative homage. It is a declaration that the story being told has a direct connection to the man who should have told it, and that this connection wasn't severed by death, but only transformed into something different, more permanent, more silent. David Arnold composed the film's original score. Arnold is a British composer who at the time was more associated with large-scale franchises, having worked on the Pierce Brosnan James Bond films, but here he delivered something completely different from his usual work. Baby Boy's score is restrained and deliberate, built with instrumentation complementing the film's visual texture without ever competing with it. There are no moments where Arnold's music tries to tell you what to feel. It creates atmosphere, sustains emotional state, and then recedes when the scene needs to breathe on its own. But the most important musical component of the film is not the original score or even the choice of Tupac. It is the use of R&B and contemporary hip-hop from the turn of the century as the sonic fabric of the character's universe. What the characters listen to, what plays in the cars, in the rooms, at the parties appearing on screen, all of this was curated with attention to cultural specificity you don't find in films, treating black community music as an interchangeable, decorative element. Baby Boy's sound is the sound of South Central in 2001, and this is a production fact, contributing to the film's general authenticity in a way that is hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. Charles Mills, as cinematographer, made choices defining the film visually in ways that continue to be influential. Baby Boy's cinematography is warm, saturated with the yellow and orange of the Los Angeles sun hitting stucco walls and asphalt over long summer days. There is none of the cool desaturation that 90s American independent cinema had popularized as the standard visual language for urban dramas. Mills chose a palette simultaneously, honest about the neighborhood's material conditions and generous with the beauty existing there. The specific late afternoon light in South Central, backyards with flowers, the colors of clothes, reflections on well-maintained cars that are one of the few real investment objects accessible to young men without access to capital. This photographic choice is political in the same way the decision to film on location is political. It refuses the aesthetics of poverty as an aesthetic mission in itself. It isn't interested in making South Central look miserable, so that a white middle-class audience feels adequately shocked or moved. It is interested in showing how the place actually looks to those who live there, with all its humanity and its beauty within existing conditions. Mills' camera has a quality of observation that sometimes feels more like a documentary than fiction. There are shots in the film, especially in the exteriors, where the camera seems to discover the scene rather than execute a pre-planned shot list. This is no accident. Singleton and Mills worked to create mobility in the camera that could react to what the actors did, following the moment instead of imposing a rigid geometry on it. For a film built on naturalistic performances, often operating in a territory between script and improvisation, this camera flexibility was essential. The film's interiors, the houses, apartments, and rooms where much of the narrative happens were filmed with a proximity that is sometimes almost claustrophobic. There is no generous visual breathing space that conventional studio cinema uses to create the illusion that characters inhabit larger, more comfortable spaces than reality allows. The spaces in Baby Boy are the size they are. The cameras are too close to let you forget it. And this proximity creates spatial tension, serving the drama in ways more classical photography could not. Bruce. Canon's editing works in conjunction with the photography in a way more visible for what it doesn't do than what it does. There are no style cuts, no accelerated montage showing the passage of time in a stylized way, no elaborate transition sequences. The cut in Baby Boy is functional and precise, built to serve the performances and the rhythm of the scenes rather than imposing an external rhythm on them. There are sequences in the film where Canon sustains a shot longer than is comfortable, where you begin to feel the weight of silence or a pause. And this willingness to sit in discomfort rather than cutting out of it is one of the film's most important editorial choices. There is a component of the visual language deserving specific attention, related to how Singleton and Mills filmed men versus how they filmed women. There is a camera gaze on male bodies, especially Jodie's body, that is simultaneously objective and complex. The camera looks at Jodie the same way a conventional studio film camera would look at a female protagonist, with attention to physical presence, movement, and the way he inhabits space. This is intentional. Singleton was making a film about masculinity and chose to put masculinity under the same type of gaze cinema usually reserves for femininity. It's a choice, creating a slight alienation effect serving the film's thematic project. The women, by contrast, are filmed with a camera respecting their agency within the scene. There is none of the exploratory male gaze defining the photography of so many films about urban environments when female characters are present. Yvette and Wanita are filmed as people whose faces matter more than any other part of their body, whose expressions are the priority visual data in any scene where they appear. This is also a political choice reflecting the viewpoint of a director who, even when critically examining the male behavior patterns of the environment he portrays, refuses the reproduction of those patterns in the film's own visual language. The result of all these choices: Mills' warm and honest photography, Canon's functional and courageous editing, the soundtrack that is both a personal tribute and a cultural document, is a film sounding and looking completely from within the universe. It portrays. There is no production distance. None of the varnish studios usually apply, even in projects pretending to be realistic. Baby Boy is filmed from the inside out, and you feel that in every frame. The film starts with a fetus. And it doesn't start that way by accident. This image, lasting perhaps 10 seconds before revealing it, is Jodie sleeping, curled up on an adult bed, is the most compact thesis statement John Singleton could have made. It says everything before a single word is uttered. This man is still inside something he should have left long ago. He is still in a position of dependency. He is still waiting for the world to nurture him instead of starting to nurture himself. He is, at some fundamental and psychological level, the film will spend 2 hours examining. A baby. The title, Baby Boy, works on multiple registers at once. On the surface, it is what Yvette calls Jodie in moments of tenderness. Pet name carrying the perfect ambiguity between affection and diagnosis. But it is also what the film is calling a whole generation. A generation of young black American men raised within structures that, with all the good intentions in the world, produced adults with a child's emotional tools. Singleton researched. This theme with a seriousness going beyond what most filmmakers put into personal projects. He publicly referenced the influence of the thinking of Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, a black American psychiatrist and essayist who spent decades writing about the effects of systemic racism on the construction of black male identity. Welsing's central argument that racism operates not only through economic and political structures, but also through psychology, shaping how black men develop or fail to develop certain aspects of emotional maturities embedded in the structure of Baby Boy, in a way needing no explicit declaration because it is in the very architecture of every male character in the film. Jody is not an isolated case. That is what Singleton wants you to understand. Sweepy has the same patterns. The men appearing on the film's margin zine corner groups, at parties. In passing, cars all operate within the same behavioral universe the film is examining. Jody is the central case study because he is the one the camera follows. But the camera could have followed any of the others and found versions of the same story with variations in detail, but not in essential structure. The concept of male infantilization explored in the film has specific historical roots Singleton articulated with clarity in interviews during the film's release. In contexts where fatherhood has been systematically interrupted, where men have been removed or prevented from fulfilling parental roles for generations. What happens is that the model of adult masculinity boys would need to observe to develop. Their own versions of that model simply isn't available. What is available are versions of masculinity emphasizing physical strength, sexual dominance, tribal loyalty, and a performative hostility to vulnerability that is actually a form of unprocessed vulnerability. Jody grew up without a father. This is established in the film with economy, without melodrama, without being used as an excuse or absolution, simply as a fact. He grew up with Wanita, with Wanita's love, with Wanita's care, and that love was real. But that love also, without Wanita intending it, functioned as a substitute for a set of growth demands Jody never had to truly face, because Wanita was always there to cushion the consequences. The paradox of intense maternal love without the counterweight of a father figure demanding responsibility is that it can produce men who feel loved, but never learned to be responsible. Melvin exists in the film precisely to represent what that father figure could have done, not because Melvin is a perfect father, he isn't, but because Melvin represents the demand. The presence of an adult man who will not cushion Jody's consequences, who will not cover his deficiencies, who will simply exist as a mirror of everything Jody is not yet. And Jody hates Melvin for that, as anyone hates anything reflecting back their own insufficiencies, the Oedipus complex. The film directly references isn't used in the classical Freudian sense of sexual attraction to the mother figure. It's used in a broader, more everyday sense, the bond between mother and son that, when not properly broken in adolescence, continues operating in adult life as a dependency tie preventing growth. Jody doesn't want Wanita to have a life of her own because Wanita's own life is proof she doesn't need him the way he needs to be needed. And if she doesn't need him, who does? What kind of man is he if his own mother can live without him? This central insecurity, this inability to separate self-worth from being needed is the emotional engine of almost all Jody's problematic behaviors. The jealousy over Yvette doesn't just come from possessiveness. It comes from the fear that if she doesn't need him, he won't exist in the way that matters. The resistance to fatherly responsibility doesn't come from a lack of love for his children. It comes from the fear that assuming full responsibility requires letting go of the position of someone being cared for and entering the position of someone who cares, which is infinitely more terrifying. Singleton built Jodie's arc through the film with a progression so subtle it is almost imperceptible until you look back and realize how much he has moved. At the start, Jodie is completely inside the shell, reactive, dependent, incapable of real emotional sustenance. But throughout the narrative, pressed by circumstances, by confrontations with Melvin, by crises with the vet, by the violent event forcing a real decision without room for ambiguity, something in him starts to crack. It doesn't resolve cleanly. There is no single moment of enlightenment where Jodie suddenly becomes mature. What there are fissures. Small openings where the light gets in. The film's final scene uses a set of images and music revisiting and transforming the symbols established in the opening. Singleton closes the circle in a way that isn't a resolution. In the conventional Hollywood sense, not the transformed hero who conquered all his goals, but something more honest and perhaps more significant. The suggestion that growth is a process and not an event, that there is no single moment when someone stops being a baby boy and becomes completely a man, but that there is a direction that can be chosen and, once chosen, changes what is possible. What the film says about black masculinity isn't that it is broken. It's that the circumstances that shaped it created patterns serving specific survival functions in specific contexts. And these patterns have a high cost when transported into the territory of intimacy and domestic responsibility. It's an important distinction. Singleton isn't pathologizing black men. He is examining the conditions, producing certain patterns, and asking the honest question of what would be required for those patterns to change. This was a conversation American mainstream cinema simply wasn't having in 2001. There were films showing violence in black communities. There were films showing systemic trauma. There were films celebrating the culture. But there were very few films sitting in the middle of the problematic male behavior of a specific black community and examining it with simultaneous compassion and demand, without vilifying and without absolving, without reducing to statistics and without elevating to myth. Baby Boy did that. That is why the film was uncomfortable for so many when it came out. That is why it divided the reactions of critics and audiences in ways simply not happening with films, content with a safer, less complicated perspective. And that is why the conversation about this film didn't stop in 2001, but kept growing over the following 2.5 decades, fueled by each new generation discovering it and recognizing that the questions Singleton asked are still open, still urgent, and still haven't been satisfactorily answered by cinema, culture, or society. You don't watch Baby Boy and come away with answers. You come away with better formulated questions. And sometimes, in cinema as in life, that is the most valuable thing someone can give you. Every work of art deserves an honest look. Not the look only celebrating, not the look only criticizing, but the look willing to say both at once without one cancelling the other. Baby Boy is a film deserving exactly that kind of attention, because its strengths are genuinely exceptional, and its flaws are real enough to deserve naming. Let's start with what the film does that is extraordinary. Baby Boy's cultural authenticity is at a level American studio cinema rarely hits when portraying urban black communities. It isn't just that the locations are real, the cast is right, or the slang and rhythm of speech and behavioral codes are precise. It is that the film feels made from the inside. There is a complicity between the film and its universe, you feel immediately if you grew up in any variation of that environment, or if you've spent enough time in it to recognize the real when it appears. Singleton wasn't representing South Central. He was documenting something he knew in his flesh, and that difference appears in every frame. The performances are the second great triumph. Tyrese Gibson delivered debut work, throwing any expectation based on his pop star identity out the window. He inhabits Jodie with a totality feeling like life rather than acting. Taraji Henson built Yvette with depth the script alone couldn't have produced. She brought layers of history and psychology, making the character much larger than her pages in the script. Ving Rhames made Melvin a presence, anchoring the film every time he appears. And Snoop Dogg proved once and for all there was an actor inside him cinema never again had the intelligence to use the same way. The third great success is thematic courage. Baby Boy says difficult things about male behavior patterns in black American communities no major American studio was willing to finance before this film, and few financed after. This is no small merit. In Hollywood, artistic courage has real cost. Uncomfortable projects are hard to sell to executives needing concepts fitting a one-sentence elevator pitch. Singleton had enough reputation to protect this project, and used that reputation without hesitation. The fourth success is the refusal of the easy resolution. Baby Boy doesn't end with Jodie completely transformed into a model of male virtue. It ends with the suggestion of movement, the possibility of change, the opening of a window where before there was only a wall. This is infinitely more honest than the complete redemption narrative a conventional studio film would have demanded, and infinitely more useful for any audience recognizing their own experience in what the film shows. But now, the flaws. They exist and must be named. The treatment of women and Baby Boy is the film's most vulnerable point, and what most appears in serious, critical analyses in the decades following its release. Yvette and Wanita are well-written and extraordinarily well-acted characters, but the narrative consistently places them in a reactive position toward Jodie. What happens to them, the decisions they make, the crisis moments they live. Everything in the script exists as a function of Jodie's arc and not their own. Yvette has a rich, emotional interior. Taraji Henson accesses magnificently, but the script rarely puts her at the center of a scene where she exists on her own, instead of as a response to something Jodie did or didn't do. This doesn't make the film misogynistic in the simple sense of the term. Singleton clearly respects these characters, clearly has awareness of how the system he is examining affects women, and clearly isn't glorifying Jodie's behavior toward them. But there is a structural asymmetry in the script that can't be ignored. The film examining the damaged men like Jodie, because the women in their lives is still fundamentally a film about the internal experience of men like Jodie. The women suffer, resist, survive, love, and all of this is shown with respect, but they don't have the same access to subjectivity Jodie has. The camera inhabits his perspective in a way it never fully inhabits theirs. This is a real limitation. Feminist critiques of the film have accurately articulated over the years, and it is a limitation Singleton himself would likely recognize if the question were put directly to him, given the honesty with which he always spoke about his own work. The second relevant flaw is pacing. Baby Boy is 129 minutes long, and there are moments in the second act where the film loses the tension it built, where scenes repeat in dynamics, variations without advancing the narrative or deepening characters significantly. There is a lot of time invested in portraying Jodie and Sweepy's daily life that is somatically justified. You need to feel the weight of the time they waste to understand what is being wasted. But in practice, create segments testing the patience of even committed viewers. This is directly connected to the third issue, which is what was cut from the original script. Ving Rhames commented on at least one occasion that the Melvin in the original script he read had more depth, more history, more scenes building the relationship between him and Jodie in ways the final cut only suggests. If those scenes had stayed, and the second act pacing adjusted by cutting some of the most repetitive Jodie and Sweepy moments, the film reaching screens could have been even stronger. The issue of commercial concessions. Singleton was forced to make 4 Columbia pictures. Is something visible in the final product to attentive eyes? There is tension between the more austere and uncomfortable vision the film could have been and the version reaching the cinema, which has more than one moment feeling calibrated not to completely alienate a broader audience. This isn't an accusation, just an observation. Every director working within the studio system navigates this territory. But it is worth noting that Baby Boy as a work of art likely exists somewhere between Singleton's original script and the final cut Columbia approved. And that imaginary place would be fascinating to see. The divided critical reception the film received at its 2001 release reveals more about the limits of mainstream American film criticism than the film's limits. Critics giving Baby Boy average reviews usually cited Jodie as a difficult character to follow or insisted the film didn't offer a clear enough moral outlet for its problematic protagonist. This is a demand we don't make of films about white protagonists with equally or more problematic behavior. Martin Scorsese spent decades making films about violent and morally complex white men without critics demanding those films provide explicit pedagogical solutions for those men's behavior. The demand for Baby Boy to be more didactic, more clearly moral, more explicitly redemptive, says something about an expectation still existing in parts of criticism that films about Black communities have an obligation to teach or resolve something that films about white communities simply have a license to observe. It is an expectation Baby Boy completely refused, and that refusal was simultaneously its act of greatest artistic integrity and part of why it received resistance from certain critical sectors. In the end, what Baby Boy unequivocally is a film made with total conviction by a director who had something genuine to say, and said it in the most honest way the system allowed. Its limitations are real. Its triumphs are larger. And the distance between what could have been and what is small enough that what is still something considerable. The summer of 2001 was competitive for American cinema in a way, making Baby Boy's market position particularly challenging. It was the season of Shrek, Wonder Woman, The Mummy Returns films, built to occupy the maximum number of screens with the minimum possible risk. Baby Boy was the opposite in almost every sense. It was an uncomfortable character drama with a protagonist studios usually struggled to sell as a conventional hero. On a subject without the immediate universal appeal fueling big opening numbers, Columbia Pictures opened the film in 1,874 theaters across the US. On June 27, 2001, the first weekend result was $8.6 million, putting Baby Boy in third place at the American box office that weekend. It wasn't the explosive result of summer blockbuster producers, but it was a solid result for a mid-budget drama not relying on special effects. An established franchise, or a top-tier star in the conventional commercial sense. What happened in the following weeks? was more revealing than the opening. Baby Boy had a relatively small box office drop in the second week. What industry jargon calls legs, the ability of a film to sustain audience over time through word of mouth. Films opening with modest numbers but dropping little week after. Weaker films people are recommending to each other, generating conversations outside theaters. Baby Boy was exactly that kind of film. The North American total reached $26 million, with another roughly $3 million added from the international market, resulting in a worldwide total of just over $29 million against a production budget. In pure financial terms, this represents a modest but real profit, especially considering marketing and distribution costs must be subtracted before any real profit appears. Columbia didn't lose money on Baby Boy. It earned little compared to its investment, which by studio standards is often the operational definition of disappointment. But the film wasn't the commercial failure some narratives suggest when describing it as having been ignored. It found its audience. It just didn't find the massive audience that would justify a sequel or franchise deal. Critical reception at the time was mixed, meaning it was good in some contexts and mediocre in others, depending on who was writing and where. On Rotten Tomatoes, the film over time accumulated an approval rating in the 70% range, number underestimating the work's quality but reflecting the real division in the original reception. Critics who understood what Singleton was doing and for whom usually wrote with enthusiasm. Critics applying criteria built to evaluate narratives centered on white middle-class protagonists tended to struggle with the material. Roger Ebert, who had one of the loudest megaphones in American film criticism at the time, gave the film 3 stars out of 4, a respectable result, recognizing the work's quality without positioning it among the year's great films. Ebert praised the performances especially. Tyrese Gibson and Ving Rhames recognized the seriousness of Singleton's intentions, but also expressed the reservations many critics had about pacing and female representation, issues that are partially valid and partially a reflection of expectations the film deliberately refused to satisfy. But the reception that mattered most for Baby Boy, the reception determining the film's place in culture, didn't come from mainstream publication. Critics? It came from the communities the film was made to reach, and there the response was of a different intensity than any conventional box office metric or critics' score can capture in Black American communities, especially those in Southern California. Baby Boy generated a conversation films rarely produce. It wasn't just about whether the film was good or bad. It was about whether it was true, and the consistent answer coming back was that yes, it was. That Jodie was someone people knew. That the dynamic between Jodie and Yvette was something people had lived. That Wanita was someone's mother. That Sweet Pea was someone's friend. The degree of recognition the film produced within its target audience is one of the most important data points about its cultural value. And it is a data point no critic score or box office number can measure. Time has treated Baby Boy with growing generosity. In 2005, TV One, a channel for black audiences, produced a special revisiting the film and its cultural impact. An investment you don't make in a work without real impact. The special brought back cast members and allowed them and the audience to talk about what the film meant. The result documented something happening organically. Baby Boy had become a cultural reference point of film people kept citing in conversations about relationships, masculinity, fatherhood, and what it means to grow up in the age of streaming. In social media, Baby Boy's legacy has had a second life. Singleton likely couldn't have fully anticipated in 2001. The film circulates constantly on Twitter and Instagram, platforms where Black American communities have cultural conversations, once happening in barbershops and backyards. Specific scenes have become meme references. Not in the trivial sense any image can become a meme, but in the sense a meaning-charged image is used to name real situations people are living. The scene where Melvin and Jody have their most direct conversation. The scene where Yvette looks at Jody in a way saying everything without a word. The opening fetus image. These images exist in cultural memory, with a persistence proving the film created language and visual vocabulary for experiences previously lacking precise cinematic representation. John Singleton's death in April 2019, at 51, brought Baby Boy back to the center of conversations about his legacy in a way simultaneously painful and revealing. Obituaries and tributes consistently identified two films as the pillars of what he built: Boy's End, The Hood, and Baby Boy. Not Shaft, not the studio projects between those two landmarks. The two films completely his, completely personal, completely built on things he needed to say about the world where he grew up and the men that world produced. That says something. The market often rewards work for hire and ignores personal work. Time frequently reverses that judgment. Baby Boy is a textbook case. The film Columbia distributed with modest expectations in a competitive summer, and which received divided reviews from a press not fully knowing what to do with it, is now recognized as one of the most accurate and necessary documents American cinema produced on black masculinity in the early 21st century, and Taraji P. Henson goes to the Emmys, Oscars, and Golden Globes, and each time the world discovers who she is, a new generation returns to Baby Boy and discovers Yvette, and discovers the whole film, and the conversation starts again. That is the life cycle of a work that truly matters. Not the immediate burst, burning fast and vanishing, but the flame remaining. There is a question worth asking before any final verdict on Baby Boy, and it is a question the film itself implicitly poses throughout its duration. Who is this film for? It isn't a rhetorical question. It is a genuine question with a genuine answer. And that answer matters because it defines what you find when you sit down to watch and what you feel when the credits roll. Baby Boy was made by John Singleton for a specific audience, for young black American men recognizing Jody as a reflection, for women who loved or love men like Jody and would finally have a cinematic language for what they live, for mothers raising sons without fathers, carrying the silent question of how much their choices contributed to who those sons became, and for entire communities living the dynamics the film examines, but rarely seeing them treated with seriousness and compassion. But what Baby Boy has demonstrated over more than 20 years is its audience is broader than any demographic definition can capture, because the questions the film asks about masculinity and responsibility, love and possession, the distance between who we are and who we could be, and the weight of circumstances, and the agency we still have those questions, belong to the human experience in a broader sense. The context is South Central. The substance is universal. So who should watch Baby Boy? Anyone who has loved someone not ready to be loved as they needed to be. Anyone recognizing in themselves behavioral patterns they know are destructive but have difficulty stopping. Anyone who has had to look inside and ask at what exact moment the child they were became the adult they are. Anyone caring about how human communities form and sometimes deform the men they produce, who will have difficulty with Baby Boy. Those needing film protagonists to be conventionally likable, taking defensible decisions, and showing consistent, linear growth. Those with no tolerance for characters repeating mistakes, knowing something but not acting on it, and loving truly but hurting truly at the same time. If you need the film to give you a reason to root for Jody before you start rooting for him, it will be a frustrating experience. Singleton isn't interested in selling Jody to you. He is interested in showing Jody to you with all his contradiction, intact, and letting you decide what to do with what you see. That is cinematic courage. And cinematic courage has a price paid by the spectator, and not every spectator wants to pay it. For those willing, what Baby Boy offers in exchange is considerable. The experience of being truly seen by a film. Being seen means the film knows. Something about human life you also know but rarely find named with such precision. And the meeting with that recognition produces something staying with you after the screen goes dark. The verdict, then, is Baby Boy a great film? Yes, it isn't perfect, and its imperfections have been clearly stated. But greatness in cinema is rarely perfection. It is the capacity to do something that matters in a way, resisting time. Baby Boy has all of that. It has a director in control of his most personal and courageous vision. It has a cast delivering work-defining careers in the case of Tyrese, Gibson, and Taraji. Henson and producing the most surprising moments of their filmographies in the case of Snoop Dogg and Ving Rhames. It has a thesis that in 2001 was urgent and in 2026 remains urgent because the conditions Singleton examined haven't vanished. They changed in detail. They continue in structure. The Baby Boy Jody represents still exists in any American city, still exists in variations in any urban context worldwide, where young people grow without the models and structures full emotional development requires. The film hasn't aged because the problem hasn't aged, and there is a final element to be said about Baby Boy beyond cinematic evaluation. John Singleton died in 2019 without making another film on the same level as Baby Boy after 2001. His career after this film was a series of work for hire, competent but generic studio projects lacking the central strength of his two great personal works. This is a real loss for American cinema, and it is the loss felt most intensely when you watch Baby Boy, knowing this was the last original script he wrote alone. The last time he put his most personal vision completely on screen without significant commercial mediation. What Baby Boy became, then, is not just a great film but the cinematic testament of a great filmmaker. The place where Singleton said what he needed to say, the way he needed to say it, with the right collaborators, at the right moment, on a subject no one else was brave enough to touch with such seriousness and specificity. That this testament arrived so early in his career that there was still so much Singleton could have done and didn't, is part of the sadness surrounding the film when seen with that awareness. But sadness doesn't diminish what exists. Baby Boy exists. It is there. It can be watched today with the same intensity as in 2001, perhaps with more intensity because time has given perspective to Singleton's choices and the value of what he built. Tyrese and Taraji's performances haven't aged. Charles Mill's photography hasn't aged. The soundtrack placing Tupac where he needs to be hasn't aged. and the questions the film asks about what it means to grow up, to love responsibly, and what separates a man from a baby boy. Those questions certainly haven't aged. Have you seen this film? If not, see it. Without haste, without expecting it to be comfortable, without demanding the protagonist be a hero you can root for without reservations. See it with the willingness to sit with something difficult and real and necessary. See it knowing Tupac should have been there, but the man found to tell this story also told it in a way time proved irreplaceable. See it knowing the young woman playing Yvette will become one of the greatest actresses of her generation, and that here, in this film, she was already everything she would become. And if you've seen it, see it again. With what you know now about who those people were, what that neighborhood was and is, and what John Singleton's death in 2019 meant for the cinema he represented. See it again and notice the things you didn't the first time, the camera inhabiting Jody from within, the Los Angeles light mills captured as if it were the last time anyone would film the city that way, and the silence Ving Rhames sustains in scenes other actors would have filled with unnecessary dialogue. Baby Boy is the film John Singleton needed to make. It is the film American cinema needed to have, and it is, more than 2 decades later, the film we still need to see.